This is a great headline from MSN.com. There are 4,000 people in a half-mile voting line in Cincinnati today. This isn't okay. This is actually from yesterday, from Sunday, early voting. And, you know, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about Rudy Giuliani. I want to talk about the FBI and James Comey and Hillary Clinton. And I want to talk about privatizing our highways, which is one of, you know, there are 7 policy prescriptions on Donald Trump's website. This is one of them, and it's one of the most overlooked. Jordan Weissman wrote a piece for it, for Slate, titled, "While You Weren't Looking, Donald Trump Released a Plan to Privatize America's Roads and Bridges." Yes. You want to go home and, you know, hop in the car and go home and visit family for Thanksgiving? It's going to cost you. Want to hop in a car and visit family for Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever the holiday may be? It's going to cost you. Yule. Trump's, he's running around going, you know, Hillary wants to spend $500 billion on infrastructure. I'm going to spend $1 trillion. Where's that trillion going to come from? Well, we're going to ask a bunch of billionaires to put up bonds. And we're going to build roads. We're going to let them charge tolls and pay themselves back. In other words, we're going to privatize our roads. Brilliant. We've half privatized our voting systems, you know, turning them over to private for-profit companies to give us voting machines and counters and things like that. But more importantly, there's massive voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression going on in the United States right now. And I mean, the numbers are truly breathtaking, truly breathtaking. The Supreme Court struck down the Voting Rights Act, or at least Section 4 of it, which said that states which have a long history of suppressing the vote of people of color can't do that. That's been the law since 1965 until Shelby, versus Holder, the Supreme Court decision, 2 years ago, I think it was, which said, no, those states can do whatever they damn well please. So now you have this, Alice Miranda Olstein wrote just a brilliant wrap-up piece about this over at the Center for American Progress's blog, Think Progress. Since the Supreme Court struck down more than a dozen Republican-controlled state legislatures, those Republican-controlled counties have shut down hundreds of polling places. A study of nearly 400 counties in Alabama, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Mississippi. These were the states that used to be covered by the Voting Rights Act. Found that those counties, just in those 400 counties in those 7 states, collectively reduced the number of polling locations available to voters by at least 16%. Eliminating more than 860 polling places. Now, you're probably not seeing any discussion of this on the network news. They may show, hey, here's a line with 4,000 people in it. It's a 10-hour line. Isn't this interesting? But they're not going to say, and it's here because Republicans cut the number of machines from 20 down to 10, or they cut the number of polling places from 16 down to 3, or whatever. They're not going to say that, because that would be blaming it on Republicans, and we don't do that in American news. In Arizona, almost every single county shut down voting locations, and more than half of the counties in Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama that provided data, the researchers did so as well. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights found that the vast majority of the closures happened in areas with a documented history of racial discrimination that used to hold elections under Justice Department supervision. But thanks to John Roberts, who said there's no racial discrimination in America anymore. That's from another time. We don't need to worry about that. You can trust those white people who run the Republican Party. Without this federal oversight, writes Alice Olstein, without this federal oversight, counties had a green light to shut down polls as they pleased, and they did so on a massive scale. Ahead of the presidential primary in March, Arizona's most populous county slashed the number of available polling places from 200 down to 60. The result, 5-hour lines. In North Carolina, 17 counties are providing fewer total voting hours than they did in 2012. And some of the cuts have been deep. Charlotte's Mecklenburg County, for example. Now, Charlotte, it's one of the more progressive parts of North Carolina. Charlotte offered 22 locations for the first day of early voting in 2012. This year, they only offered 10, resulting in 3-hour-long lines. Now, that's the equivalent of a poll tax, because if you're a working person who's paid by the hour and you have to take off to vote, and let's say you're being paid $15 an hour, it used to take you an hour to vote, it used to cost you $15. Now it takes you 3 hours to vote, it's costing you $45. Republicans know this. This is not an accident. This is not stupidity, which is how the media plays it. Oh, somebody screwed up. Nobody screwed up. This is intentional voter suppression. Guilford County, home to a large historically black college, went from having 16 early voting locations in 2012 in the last presidential election. Guess how many they've got this year? Historically black college. A lot of people, a lot of black people. 16 early voting locations. This is in North Carolina. This year, one. Turnout in Guilford County over the first few days of early voting was down 85%. The media is reporting that the early vote among African Americans for Hillary Clinton, the early vote among African Americans is down. Has anybody in the media told you that, for example, Guilford County, one of the blackest counties in North Carolina, went from 16 early voting locations to 1? And thus the early vote went down 85% because people just can't stand in line for 20 hours. 6 counties across North Carolina that cut polling locations saw turnout drop at least 50%. In Election Day, 12 North Carolina counties formerly covered by the Voting Rights Act will collectively have 27 fewer polling places than they did 4 years ago. Arizona, 212 fewer polling places than they had in 2012. Pima County, which has the highest population of Latino and Native American voters in Arizona, closed 62 locations, more than any county in the country. Cochise County, which has an even larger Latino population, slashed nearly 2/3 of its voting places. I mean, if you don't think that, sure, first they do the voter ID laws, then they try to prevent registration, then you get Chris Kobach and interstate crosscheck knocking hundreds of thousands of people off the voting rolls. And then you make people stand in line for 6, 8, 10 hours to vote. They did it in Ohio in 2004, remember? They're doing it in Ohio again. This is what happens when Republicans control voting in minority areas. It's real simple. This is not rocket science. There's no magic to this. Have you encountered this in your attempts to early vote? 866-OUR-VOTE, by the way, is the number to call if you have problems voting. 866-OUR-VOTE. And frankly, I would think that, a long line would be a problem. I want to talk about privatizing roads and talk about James Comey as well. We'll be back right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
New York Times has a piece on the front page today. 5 ways Republicans are threatening voting rights. New York Times will talk about it. News networks, not so much.